feel.
Aussie Home Loans' John Simon. Well, banking seems to be on the lips of every politician today. Let's go to Canberra now for Chris Uhlmann's regular Pollie's panel. He's joined by Labor's Kelvin Thomson and the Liberal Senator Corey Bernardi.
Corey Bernardi, Kelvin Thomson, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chris. Good afternoon, Corey.
Well, Kelvin Thomson, to you first. Westpac has posted a profit of $6.3 billion to September. That's up 84% on last year. What do you make of what you've seen in the last 24 hours?
Well, the first thing, Chris, is we should replace all those overpaid chief economists from the likes of CommSec and KPMG and Macquarie Bank with an octopus, and we should put that octopus in a tank, and we should lower 2 boxes of food into the tank and mark one rate rise and mark the other one no rate rise and see which one the octopus chooses. That would be cheaper and much more accurate than those overpaid private sector economists.
Corey Bernardi? Good idea?
It's hard. No, I don't think that's a good idea at all. But what we've got to establish is the banks need to be profitable. They need to make money. But we also need to make sure there's enough competition that the consumers get a fair go. And quite frankly, that's what Joe Hockey highlighted and Wayne Swan mocked last week. It's interesting that Wayne Swan has now changed his tune and is trying to rapidly put together his own policy to deal with excessive profiteering by the banks.
Kelvin Thomson, how do we get more competition in the banking sector? Their competitors were essentially wiped out during the global financial crisis. Now trying to get back some of that competition seems to be an extraordinarily hard thing to do. Or do you regulate it?
Chris, I think it's clear that while the banks are crying poor and complaining about the cost of money, the truth is that they haven't increased the rate of return for their depositors by 0.45% as the Commonwealth raised its interest rate yesterday. And if you look at the profits, you mentioned the Westpac with a profit of over $6 billion, and you look at the Commonwealth Bank having made a profit of over $6 billion, the proof of the pudding is in the eating there. We saw their chief executive of the Commonwealth get a salary rise last month of the order of 75% to in excess of $16 million. So last week one of the bank chief executives was talking about Hugo Chavez. Now the fact is I bet Hugo Chavez hasn't got a salary of in excess of $16 million. Frankly, some of the conduct by the bank executives is making Hugo Chavez look positively respectable.
And that was,
now, in terms of the issue of competition, this is something that Wayne Swan has signalled that he's working on. I support the initiatives in relation to mortgage exit fees, the initiatives backing the small lenders, and the prospect of more to come in the next few weeks.
Corey Bernardi, of course, yours is the party of the free market, and yet it seems that you were the first to go to the barricades when it came to more regulation.
We were actually fighting for increased competition and a fair deal for all consumers. Let's put some facts on the table. It's been established now the cost of funding for banks and their margins have returned to normalcy. There is absolutely no excuse for the Commonwealth Bank to almost double the official interest rate rise from yesterday. And despite 33 warnings from a very ineffective and clearly unpersuasive Treasurer, the banks ignore him and continue to do this. We just want to see a fair go for consumers, and I don't know how we can be criticised for that, and yet the Labor Party did exactly that last week. And this week they're changing their tune because they realise once again they've got it wrong and they're rapidly losing control of our economy.
Kelvin Thomson?
I think the banks have only got themselves to blame if policymakers look at what is happening now and believe that there needs to be change. The bank executives seem to be adopting a heads we win, tails you lose approach to the matter, and clearly that is a matter of public concern. It will lead to responses by policymakers, and it is leading to responses by policymakers.
Are we going to see anything concrete, though, do you think, Corey Bernardi? Because at the moment it seems like both sides are blustering and the banks have got their fingers in their ears.
Well, we can only look at the track record that when the Coalition were in power, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister wielded a big stick and kept competition and kept the banks competitive and giving consumers a fair go. We haven't seen that from this government. We've seen them spend far too much money and stimulate the economy, and that's giving us interest rate rises, and the banks are using that as an excuse to make even more money and make it more difficult for families. I mean, in the first 3 months of this financial year, the government has spent $25 billion more than it's taken in. That's over $100 million a day. It's losing control of the budget, it's losing control of the economy, and it's now also lost control of Australia's borders because we're being overwhelmed by people entering this country illegally.
So, Kelvin Thomson, all your fault.
Chris, the real interest rates now are significantly lower than what they were during the time of the coalition. But the real thing which is driving upward pressure on interest rates is increasing prices, and that in turn is driven by increasing population. It's my view that what we should be doing is seeking to stabilise our population, return skilled migration to the levels of the mid-1990s, 25,000. If we did that, then the upward pressure on prices and the upward pressure on interest rates would disappear, and people would find it much easier to make ends meet.
Corey Bernardi, does that appeal to you? Of course, you were assisting the opposition leader on population.
Yeah, absolutely I was. But look, interest rates are driven by an injection of additional money and an increase in money supply. You simply cannot inject $25 billion additional dollars in only 3 months and do that for successive quarters and not expect there to be some inflationary pressures. Families in this country are already struggling with electricity bills, with their mortgage payments, with the cost of food, and this government, which came into power promising to offer relief, has actually been leaving the Australian family adrift.
All right, one
it's
last
not good
point.
enough.
Sorry, one last point on this before we move on. Kelvin Thomson, when it comes to the matters of population, you just raised again there. You've been speaking about this for some time now. Any sign that your own party is actually listening to you?
Well, it's conspicuous that in the last election campaign, Julia Gillard announced that she was not in favour of a big Australia. She has established several panels which are working on this issue and reporting to the Minister for Population, Tony Burke. I expect that those reports will be released presently, and the government will make decisions based around them.
Corey Bernardi, you've raised a concern that you have about Sharia-based financing. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, the government has been investigating some changes to our regulatory system and perhaps even our tax and legal codes to accommodate Sharia financing in this country. I don't believe the country should have a two-tier system of regulation or legal system. I've provided a background briefing to my party, and we're going to wait and see what the government finally puts forward and recommends next year.
But just quickly,
we want an open and level playing field, that's all.
Just quickly on this, though, I mean, their concern is about usury, of course, which if you actually trace it all the way back, you're going to find that in the Old Testament as well. Is there any real problem with them coming up with an alternative way of financing their businesses?
Well, it could give rise to quite a significant change to our regulatory and legal framework, and we want to make sure that all Australians are operating under a level playing field. That's a very sensible and reasonable precaution. One of the things, though, Chris, is that whenever this government is called to account and questioned about, some of their policy agenda and initiatives, they respond with rhetoric and name-calling, but really don't respond to the genuine concerns. We've seen it in any number of areas. Most recently, in asylum seekers, pink bats. We saw last week when they were mocking Joe Hockey. This week they're having a go at me. They don't like to be questioned, but unfortunately their policies and their agenda doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
Kelvin Thomson?
Chris, there's no detailed proposal before the Parliament or before the electorate, and obviously we all get the opportunity to look at one if such a proposal comes forward. But in terms of the principle of these things, I don't think there is any problem in having increased choice and increased competition in financial matters. I mean, this is precisely the issue we were talking about a moment ago, the lack of competition, and I think that the Liberal Party, which says, we're the party of choice and competition, ought to be conceptually supportive of this. Corey has said that this might lead to an accommodation in future of Sharia law and take us potentially into the area of allowing Muslim men to have more than one wife, for example. I think that is a very long bow indeed. I certainly don't support the application or accommodation of Sharia law in Australia, and I don't think any other policymaker does either.
Senator Bernardi?
Well, I would merely say that we should all be working under the same legal and regulatory framework in this country. That is a level playing field, and if products comply with that and people want to enter into them, that's entirely up to them. But I'm saying we shouldn't have a two-tier system, and I think most of Australia would agree with that.
Kelvin Thomson, the Victorian election is on the way. We will be with us shortly. Are you concerned that the Labor Party is really losing a lot of ground to the Greens?
Well, there's been an increase in the Greens' primary voter level of support apparent through the course of the last year. I think in part this is a question of response to environmental issues. So if the Labor Party is to continue its level of primary support and increase that level, we need to be tackling climate change, we need to be reducing carbon emissions, we need to be protecting the environment. The other thing I'd say more generally and broadly, Chris, is that I think that the drop in our primary level of support during the course of the past year or so, and I'd put this nationally as well as looking around the states, is due largely to cost of living pressures and concerns about these things. This is not confined to Australia. You look at the election results just happening in the United States as we're talking, where people are confronting cost of living pressures. They tend to take out those concerns on governments, and in Australia that might be by moving to the Greens, in the United States by moving to the Tea Party. That doesn't mean that they agree with each and every policy of the Greens in Australia or each and every policy of the Tea Party in America, but it does mean that people are concerned about cost of living pressures, and they're looking for action by governments which makes it easier for them to make ends meet and doesn't have them thinking that life's getting harder and we have to work harder.
Finally, Corey Bernardi, do you think that the Liberals should just reflexively give their preferences to the Greens, because the former Prime Minister John Howard was suggesting that perhaps in the long run that might not be a good outcome for the Liberal Party?
Well, make no bones about it. Labor and the Greens are in an alliance. They are running the country at the moment, and they're failing the families of Australia. Policy preferences is always a matter for the organisational wing of any party, and I think it should be considered on its merits. We need to do anything to get rid of incompetent governments and their Labor incompetent governments, and in some cases they're in alliance with the Greens at a state level as well as at the national level. So these should be handled on their merits according to the best interests of the coalition.
Corey Bernardi, Kelvin Thomson, thank you.
Good to talk with you.
Thanks.
Well, now to sport.